Hello and welcome to the fifth video in the Tableau training from Analytics University at Consumers Energy. This video is a follow-up of our video 4 on graphs. Our objectives for this video are that you'll be able to create a data visualization without the help of the Show Me feature, that you'll be able to add a third variable to some of your visualizations in a meaningful way, and we will be taking a deeper look at how to edit features of a graph such as the shape, size, and color. So here we are on the Tableau server. Again, I suggest that you go into the training project. You find the workbook that you created in our third video, and hopefully you were working in our fourth video and saved. We can click View, view any of the tabs, and then click Edit. We can open a new sheet at the bottom, and hopefully now you're ready to follow along with this video. This is the worksheet that we left off of in the last video. One feature that I have neglected to tell you about is how to name your worksheets. And you may have already figured this out, but the most efficient way is to go down to the bottom where we have our tabs of the different sheets that are open. We can click on the name of our sheet twice, and then we can give it a name that we'd like. So I'm going to call this Bank Tellers Pie Chart. And then we'll notice that not only did the name in the tab change, but so did the header above my visualization. I'm going to do that really quickly for sheet number 7. I'll call this one Population Bar Chart. And now we're ready to begin. So in our last video, we learned how to use the Show Me feature to help us create some nice visualizations for our data. In this video, we'd like to still use Show Me to help us with some of our visualizations, but it's important to kind of take note of where Tableau is putting the variables that we are entering into the Show Me feature. This will help us create visualizations by hand if Tableau won't quite give us exactly what we have in mind for our visualization. So I'm going to use this pie chart as an example. So I'm going to open a new sheet, and I'm going to create this pie chart again in the same way that we did in the last video. I'm going to let Show Me do it. And as I do it, we're going to pay attention to what Show Me is doing and where it's putting our variables. So for the last video, I went down to bank tellers, and then I clicked the control button and I selected subregion. Control subregion. And then I just let the Show Me feature in Tableau take over by clicking the pie chart, and there we have it. I'm going to quickly change this view again. So right now we are in the standard view, which is the default when you're creating visualizations. I'm going to quickly change it to the entire view so that it looks a little bit better for our purposes. Again, it's created a spot for null. I'm just going to select that, and then I'm going to click exclude. And now, with the exception of the labels, we have the same graph as we did last time. So let's take a look at where Tableau put our variables and what it is doing with these variables. So if we look in the marks pane, we see that we have added subregion, some banks automated tellers per 100,000 adults, and we've added that same variable a second time. The icon next to each of these variables is where we can get some information about what Tableau did with these variables. So if we look next to the subregion, we have the colors icon, and that hopefully is pretty obvious what happened there. Each subregion is assigned a color. Next to the first sum automated bank tellers, we have this little wedge. They call that the angle. So each one of our angles is made up of the information in the bank tellers rows or columns in our data set. So the bigger the number in that row, the bigger the wedge. And again, this is by subregion. This circle down here is actually one that doesn't really need to be there. Let's go ahead and delete the angle for a moment by clicking remove. And this remains the same. If we remove that one, now we have one pie chart with each region having equal measures. So we have to add a measure to this pie chart in order to get the angles to be indicative of the size of the measure. So if I add this back in, right now the icon next to the sum banks is a detail, and we want that to be different. A detail is just a feature, and we'd like it to be a specific feature. When we add a detail, it rarely changes anything about the visualization itself. So we're going to change this to angle, and now we have the same graph we did a moment ago. If we change this to size, we still have the same visualization we had a moment ago. So either one of these will do for our purposes, but I'd like you to notice that when we come down here at the bottom, when we change the angle to size, it's telling us, it's giving us a legend that tells us the bigger the size is 28,296. Let's take a look at this, at the parts of this, and look, and we see that the European Union is the biggest chunk, and it represents 12,860. So from this we can tell that this 28,296 is the aggregate total of all of these combined. Now that might be useful information to you, it might not, but it is important to note that by changing the feature in the marks pane, we've added that part to our legend. I don't necessarily think we need it, so I'm going to take that out. So now we have our pie chart the same way that we set it up in the last video, except for the labels, and we also have this legend here as well. So it's up to you whether or not you want to have both the angle and the size feature in your graph. But I do like the idea of having labels in my graph. So if we change this sum banks, instead of being angle to label, we can see that now every slice of the pie is the same size, but they have numbers on the outside. So we have labels, but the size is different. So let's go back and change that to the angle again. And now, in order to get it the way that we want it to look, we have to add this measure a second time. So I'll add it to the marks pane. It's added as a detail. And now I can click the icon next to the variable and select label. And because I have it added twice, I have both the size represented in each slice of the pie, and I have the number of each subregion as well, marked as a label. Now, let's go back a moment and remove this. I'll remind you, I dragged the variable from the measures pane into the bottom of the details, and then I changed the icon from detail to label. Another way that we can do this is by dragging that measure again directly to how we want it represented in our visualization. So I want it to be a label, so I'm going to drop it right on top of label, and now I can see each of the region's size again. Just another way to do the same thing. In the last video, we also had the name of each region, so we're going to add that. Again, in the last video we had the name of each subregion, so we're going to add that. Again, subregion is already in our visualization acting as a color, so we need to add subregion again to act both as a color, which is already happening, and now as a label. So I'm going to drag and drop that right on top of label. And so now my visualization looks just like this one in the last video. In the last video, we also mentioned that if you would prefer the labels be in the opposite order of how they are now, we can simply drag and drop one label on top of the other in the marks pane. So now my subregion is on top of the figure amount for that subregion, and all I did was switch the order in this pane, and the graph adjusts appropriately. Okay, so now I'd like to take a second to talk about some other graphs that we haven't created yet. So we've created a bar graph, and we've created a pie chart. I'd like to show us how to create a stacked bar chart, which is really just a variation of the bar chart we created in our last video. So in case you didn't follow along the last video or you didn't save, I'm going to recreate this bar chart right here with one difference. So the first thing that we did was we had date, and we had the population total count. Now in the last video, we need to hit Control. In the last video we selected both of these variables, we hit the Show Me feature, and then we selected horizontal bar chart. Then we played with the visualization to make it look the way that we want it to look. Again, in this video, the objective is to maybe kind of figure out what Show Me is doing to create these visualizations. Personally, I think that this visualization is easier to create by ourselves than the pie chart even was. So all we note here is that it is adding the date to the rows, and it is adding the sum population total to the columns. So let's clear the sheet and try and do that for ourselves. I'm going to make one difference. In the last video, we swapped the rows and columns, that's this button right here, so that it would be a vertical bar chart instead of a horizontal bar chart. So now I can do that for myself by knowing that I need to have the dates represent the columns, and that I need the population total count to be represented in the rows. Now, when I added this, you can see that Tableau has made a line graph for me rather than the bar chart that I wanted. That's the Show Me feature in action. So what I'm going to do to fix this is I'm going to go to the Marks pane, and I'm going to choose from the drop-down menu the type of mark that I want it to create. Instead of automatic and letting the Show Me feature decide, I can select any of these that I want. I'm going to select the bars, and now we have a similar bar chart to the one that we had last time. Now, in the last video, we created a filter for each region by dragging region to the filters, and we could see that we had a region filter created to the right of our visualization, and we can play with that, and the graph moves accordingly. This time, I'm going to maybe do a little variant on this. I am going to remove my filter, and instead of having there be a filter that you can select and deselect, perhaps I'd like this visualization to convey information visually rather than having to filter it and get to the visualization through different steps. So that's going to be what we call a stacked bar chart, where each bar will remain the same height as it is currently to represent the population of the world in each of these years, but the bar will be divided into each region by color. So in order to do that, I'm going to select region, and then I can open Show Me, and Show Me has a way to get to that stacked bar chart, but I'd like you to take a second, maybe pause the video, and think to yourself, if I want to have these bars divided by region, how would that look? Where would I put the region variable in order to make that happen? So we can use the show me feature to give us our answer. We'll pay attention to what they did with region. So now I have a stacked bar chart. Each section of each bar represents a different region. So orange is Africa, red is Asia, so on and so forth. Again, the height of each bar stayed the same as it did before I added region, because it's still the world's population for each year. But now we want to pay attention to where did Tableau put the region. So it put it in marks, and it put it with a color mark. If that's what you guessed, congratulations. And if not, that's okay. As we see more of these visualizations, and as you play on your own in Tableau, you'll become familiar with how the show me thinks and how Tableau interprets where you put different variables. So in order to create a stacked bar chart, again, instead of just having a bar chart, or once I have just a bar chart, all I have to do is add how I want each bar to be broken down to the colors pane, and it creates for me a stacked bar chart. Okay, I'm going to double click on the tab of this sheet, and I'm going to rename this sheet, let's say stacked bar chart. You can call it whatever you'd like. And now we can see at the bottom the tab name has changed, as well as the title of the entire sheet. I'm going to open a new sheet, and I'm going to construct a line graph. Line graphs are great for showing us trends in our data, and they're really important. So in order to do this, I'm going to click date. I'm going to use finance GDP per capita. So I'm going to hit Control, click, and I'm going to go to Show Me. I'm going to let Show Me suggest or show me exactly what I can use in order to represent this data. I'm going to use the line graph continuous. And now I had Show Me create this line graph for me. Again, I'd like to kind of demonstrate how we can create these graphs for ourselves. So before I clear the formatting of this sheet, I'd like you to take a look at the year right here and notice that it is in a green pill. It's in a green field. So I'm going to clear this really quickly, and I'm going to construct it by hand. First, date went into the columns, and finance GDP per capita went into the rows. Now it again makes a line graph for me by default, so that's kind of nice. But you can see here that the year date is blue instead of green, as it was a moment ago when Show Me did it. What Show Me did was it converted this variable from a discrete number to a continuous variable. So discrete meaning each year is by itself. We're thinking of them as columns, instead of thinking as time being continuous and marching forward. So in order to change this to being continuous, which in this data set I will admit isn't really that useful, because each measurement for population was taken on the same day of each year. But in other data sets, when we have monthly sales or quarterly sales, we want to represent time a lot of times by a continuous variable. So in order to do that, we're going to drop down the menu in this variable, and you'll notice that year, quarter, month, day is in this section, and so is year, quarter, month, week, and day in this section. The difference is these are our categorical variables. These are the discrete variables, versions of this variable. And down here are the continuous versions of this variable. So I'm going to select month. And now for this data, all of these will show July for every year. But if this data set had measures for each month, we could highlight each month of each year for these 11 years. So this is our line graph. I'm going to add a filter to this because we have the GDP per capita of the entire world represented here, and that might be an interesting graphic to look at, but perhaps I'd like to see that broken down by country, region, or subregion. The countries will come up with an awful lot, so I'm going to do it by region. I'm going to drag that to the filters pane, and now I can filter that data out how I'd like. Again, I'm a big fan of the customization of showing the apply button. And now I can select maybe, let's just see what happened in the Americas during this time. And it will show me that trend line. Maybe I'd like to do just Africa, and so on and so forth. I'm going to double click the name of the sheet. I'm going to call this a line graph of GDP per capita, and we'll move on to the next graph. I'm going to open a new worksheet, and this graph is going to be a scatter plot. Scatter plots are very useful for comparing two measures to one another. If we open Show Me and we highlight the scatter plot, it kind of says the same thing. In order to create a scatter plot, we need 0 or more dimensions and 2 to 4 measures. So when we want to compare two measures against one another, a scatter plot is very useful. In order to demonstrate this, I am going to use business exports, click, press Control, and I'm going to use business imports, click. I'm going to select the scatter plot from Show Me, which it's actually recommending, and then it is created. So now my scatter plot only has one scatter, so that's not going to be very useful. Also, it's important to recognize again, where is this data going? So it's putting one of the variables into the rows and one of the variables into the columns. It doesn't matter. Again, if I would prefer exports be on the x-axis and imports be in the y, all I have to do is press the Swap Rows and Columns button. So now back to my one data point. That's not very helpful. This is the sum total of business exports by percent GDP versus the sum total of business imports percent GDP in the entire world over the course of the 11 years that my data spans. So I want to break that down a little bit. Instead of using sum, maybe I'd prefer looking at average over the course of the 11 years. So average per year. So I'm going to change that. I'm going to click down and go to measure and average like we have done in the past. And now I still only have one data point though, so I need to categorize these by something, maybe by one of my measures. So I can do that by a country, I can do it by region, subregion. I'm going to select subregion for this particular example. I'm going to put it down here in the marks. Now you'll note that it went in as a detail. So it's just adding more details, more actual marks to my graph, which is exactly what I wanted. So now each one of my dots represents one of the subregions. Next, I don't really like the look of my marks. I'd rather them be, instead of these little open circles, these little rings, I just want them to be normal dots. So I'm going to go to the marks, select the drop down, and instead of letting it automatically choose how it's representing these, I'm going to select circle. And now I just have dots. I think that looks better. Next, I can change maybe the color. I don't necessarily like blue, so I'm going to choose, I like green. And the next thing that we can do is we can add a third measure to this data. And this is one of our objectives. It's a little bit more advanced, but it might bring another level of information to my visualization. So I'm going to add the finance, I believe is where it's at. Oh, it is under business, trade, percent GDP. I'm going to drag that to my marks. Now you'll notice by default it's been put in as a detail, which didn't do anything to my visualization, and it has also been put in by default as a sum. I'm going to change that to average quickly. And then I'd like to be able to kind of visualize this variable somehow. So I'm going to choose to do this by selecting size. And now you'll notice that each dot in the graph has changed, with smaller dots representing less trade by percent GDP and bigger dots representing more. It's also created that legend for me. Next, I can change the size of my dots by selecting the size square in the marks pane and sliding up or down until I think it looks the way that I'd like it to look. The last thing I notice here is that the green on green gets a little bit tough to tell what's going on in some of these places. So instead of maybe making every one of these green, maybe I'd like every subregion to be its own color. So rather than having this be a detail, I'm going to have it be changed to color. And now each subregion is assigned a color, and I can easily tell where one mark begins and where one mark ends. Additionally, I can tell what subregion that mark is attributed to. I'm going to change the name of this sheet to scatterplot. Scatterplot 2 for me. I already have a scatterplot. And then move along. The last type of graph that I would like you to see is a map graph. So I'm going to select country, and I'm going to select the show me, and you can see that only three of my visualizations are even able to be selected. I'm going to have you select the map, and a map of the world is brought up. Again, noting what Tableau did, it added latitude and longitude to my columns and rows, so we could have done that by ourselves. The latitude and longitude are down here at the bottom, but this is actually one where it's really quite simple to let Tableau just take it over. And each country is added as a detail to my map, so each country is just in blue. If I mess up the graph, I can always select zoom home, and it will bring me back to the original visualization. And now I want to add a measurement to this. I want to add one of my measure variables. I'm going to select, let's do military, armed forces personnel. I'm going to drag that to the marks pane. I'm actually going to skip just dragging it to the marks pane. I'm going to add it straight to color. So Tableau has automatically said, okay, if you want to add this measure to color, we're going to make it a gradient. I can see the legend has been brought up on the side, and I can see it is from light blue, meaning less, to dark blue, meaning more military personnel. It's also, again, important to realize that this is aggregate. This is the sum of the military over the course of the 11 years. So that might not be the best representation of our data. So I'm going to change this to an average. And then I also maybe want the difference between less and more to be more striking. So right now it's light blue to dark blue. So in order to do this, I can select the color square, select Edit Colors, go to the drop-down menu next to Automatic, and I have all of these gradients to choose from. I'm a big fan of the red, green, gold diverging, so I'm going to select that. Wait for it to load, and then click Out. Finally, what I'd like to show you is how Tableau works with your filters in a map graph. So I'm going to filter this by region, Again, the region filter is brought up underneath my legend. I am going to select Customize Show Apply. That way it doesn't load in between each selection. And let's say I just want to look at Europe. So let's take a look at Europe for a moment before I select this. You'll notice that Europe is very red right now. Not a lot of average military armed forces when compared to other countries in the world. So what's going to happen though is when I change to just being Europe, my map zooms in, and now I just have a scaled view of just the region I've selected. And also, now every country has been scaled appropriately on my new legend. I can do the same thing for, let's say, Africa next, but before I go to Africa, let's look at what that looks like. So right now, Africa is dark red with a little bit of orange here in Egypt. If I select just Africa and hit apply, the map will zoom into Africa, and now my scaling here has changed. You'll maybe notice that before the top end of this scale was in the millions, and now it's below a million. Instead of being orange, Egypt is now green because it has the most military in Africa, and all of the regions have changed together. So this concludes video 5, Graphs Part 2. In the next video, we'll learn how to put all the skills you've learned in this tutorial together to create a dashboard. Before you exit out of Tableau, if you've been following along, I hope that you save your workbook so that you can pick it up again later. In this video, we learn how to create a data visualization by hand without the help of the Show Me feature. We've learned how to add third variables to some visualizations in a meaningful way, and we've learned how to edit features of a graph in detail, such as the shape, the size, and the color.